Hello and welcome. In this episode of Cloud State of Play, we are going to be asking, is SaaS really cloud? Also, the Intel and AMD duopoly, is it under threat from ARM? And finally, will developers accept platform engineering? All very interesting topics. And if you want to hear more about them, then stick around. Hello and welcome to the Cloud Therapist channel. I'm Richard Simon. This is the Cloud State of Play for October 2023. As always, I have Paul Bevan with me, the irreplaceable Paul Bevan with me, ready for another 3 topics to go through for this month, Paul. Hopefully we'll find some interesting things to discuss again. How are you doing?
I'm not too bad, thank you, Richard. Good as always to speak, and yeah, plenty's been happening this month, I think, by the look of it. So yeah, it should be an interesting session.
I think as we were agreeing what topics to go through, I did look at some of our back catalogue of topics that we haven't got around to looking at, just yet. And I was thinking, I don't think we can squeeze all of those into the year. So we may have to do them at the end of year review or something like that, maybe touch on them briefly. But anyway, okay, so the topics for this October edition are, number one, is SaaS really cloud? So is software as a service really cloud? So we're going to be discussing that and maybe go back and forth a little bit on that and sort of hear our views. Number two, the Intel and AMD duopoly, that's a word, is that under threat from ARM? So that's the kind of the standard sort of x86 world versus the sort of the up and coming ARM world, the kind of the mobile and all these sort of risk-based sort of technologies and things like that. And then the third one is, will developers accept platform engineering? So platform engineering seems to be a recent topic that's kind of encroaching into that DevOps space. I've actually presented on it in the last couple of keynotes that I've done recently over the last few weeks. So yeah, platform engineering, is it actually something that developers want? So that's the third topic that we're going to discuss today. Okay, so let's kick off, Paul, with the first of our topics, and that was something that you wanted to bring to the table, which is SaaS really cloud?
Yeah, it's been sort of one of those things that's been sort of like an itch you're having to scratch every now and again. You keep coming across observations and talks and chats with people, and you think, I must come back to that. But what brought this to a head was a couple of roundtables that I hosted recently, one in Manchester and one in Germany. Small roundtable, dinner roundtables, so about 20 people. So it's hardly a representative sample of the world. But one thing that came out very strong, we were talking about hybrid infrastructure environments and how do you maintain operational excellence. And everybody there, had cloud in some form. But what was really interesting was how many of those 20, their cloud was SaaS. That was really interesting. It wasn't as if they had, were developing cloud apps. They'd actually just decided to use SaaS, tools and software in a number of spaces. But the thing that came across very strongly was twofold. One was a cost issue, and this is really not about cost. And a concern that virtually all of them had was that where they were seeing real cost pressures was in the way in which the software prices were going up, and the way in which they were being charged wasn't necessarily very flexible. And that applied both to the tools that an AWS or a Microsoft Azure or a Google Compute provide as part of their environment, as well as the sort of major SaaS platforms like Salesforce now and PeopleSoft and all those sort of things. So that was an almost exclude. But the thing that really sort of hit me was when they talked about where the challenges were coming with the licensing. And you suddenly think, hold on a minute, licensing sounds like a very old term. And actually what you're finding is that infrastructure as a service, and to an extent platform as a service, is charged really on a consumption basis. And I've always said, as part of my research, that cloud is at its heart, genuine cloud is a different consumption model that's all about paying for what you use, rapid up and down scalability, self-service, all those sort of things. And when it came to when they were describing their SaaS environments, it felt much more like an old outsourcing.
Right.
You were getting, and it was interesting to note, there was in the papers or in the press yesterday, AWS or Amazon, not AWS, Amazon dropping multi-million-dollar deal on Microsoft for Office license. Yes. And you suddenly think, okay, and what came out of the dinners was that they pay these licenses and they're not sure they're getting value for them, because how much are they being used? Are they using all the functionality? I've had to buy 500, 1,000 or whatever seats, and therefore that's not really what you would call cloud. I mean, the whole idea of cloud was you pay for what you use. Now, I may be being unfair to the software vendors, and so in that is quite a difficult model to get. It's one thing to meter the use of a server or a storage device. It might be something completely different, and I'm not a developer, and and I don't maintain software systems. That might be hugely difficult. But the real challenge for me was that, and in fact, one of the customers, and I won't, because it was a pretty much Chatham House rules discussion, I'm not going to say who they were and what even sectors they came from. Yeah. But they were all pretty senior. One of them said to me later on during the session, I put my hand up and said, yes, we're using some cloud. He says, I have to say now, having had this discussion, I don't think we are.
Right.
Because
revelation for him then.
It was, absolutely. I mean, it was a public, all I will say is it was a public sector organization, not a commercial organization. And so very, very interesting that people came back and said, this is not genuine cloud as the way you've described it. It's something else. Right. And there was another byproduct too, which again, I found slightly alarming, was that, and it sort of plays to the old outsourcing routines, which was a lot of these guys who had quite complex hybrid environments that they were dealing with, have literally abrogated all responsibility for the performance to the software supplier. And one of the things about cloud is, you say, genuine cloud is it's a shared responsibility model. Yeah. And there were 2 or 3 of them who just said, when I challenged them around how do they assure their own senior management about, the performance and availability of the software as a service, sort of looked at me as if I'd asked a completely sort of off the wall question. And it was, well, we just leave it to them. And you think, I know, their plates were full. I mean, put it like this, they were dealing with very complex environments, and all sorts of things that could go wrong. And they'd literally gone, we'll go cloud, and I'll just do software as a service, and I'll let them deal with it, let the supplier deal with it. So to me, it was a sort of aha moment that said, is this genuine cloud or really just a version of outsourcing and managed services? And we need to think carefully about this. I mean, I was seeing it, because I've spent a lot of time in the last few years looking at availability and performance of networks and infrastructure in general. And when you look at all the tools that run that, they've all been moving to the cloud. And it's one of those itches I must have been sort of scratching at, not quite understanding the implications, was that virtually all of them were saying, how do you license it? Is it per use basis? Well, it's per user or per server, but we're in the cloud. You think that's not quite the model. So it might work, but is it genuine cloud? And if you look at all the reports that we've seen, those sort of research reports that look at which infrastructure as a service, PaaS and SaaS always comes out as the biggest spend. It always comes out as the biggest spend. So to an extent, a lot of the sort of revenue growth you've seen in cloud, a lot of it is down to SaaS. And yet, to me, it doesn't feel like genuine cloud. Now, people may say, well, that's actually irrelevant. And so, but the concern was, and this is something we'll maybe touch on, we've touched on in the past and touch on again, is again, you come back to the fact that in that environment, you're actually locking yourself in. And so the lock-in is not, at the infrastructure level. The lock-in might be a bit more at the platform level. The lock-in is really coming at the software as a service level. And final piece from me is it's expensive. Just think about, I don't know about you, I've got Microsoft Office 365. I use a fraction of its capability, but I'm paying for it on an annual basis. If somebody had told me over 3 years or 4 years how much I'd have spent on Microsoft Office, I'd have told them, get lost. And I'm spending it because you're not quite noticing it, and so I think there's let's just say, as a purist cloud person, you ought to be looking at SaaS and going, is it really cloud? Is the SaaS that I'm using developed in such a way that it really is a cloud-based tool? Or have you really just lifted and shifted it into the cloud and you're still charging me on the basis of licenses and seats and users? And so that was my beef. But it was all 20 of them were all moaning, I think is the best way of describing, about the increasing software costs they were getting. There was very little, chat and back chat around cost of infrastructure. It was all around cost of the software.
Yeah, and I think the thing I picked up on is that you were talking about kind of licensing and not in the terms of subscriptions, which is kind of how normally I think they would be called, and being and again, I'm not an expert on sort of those cloud subscriptions, but being per seat versus being sort of pay as you go, or kind of some kind of a tracking sort of thing, system. I mean, I'd certainly want to see those types of SaaS solutions we mentioned, the likes of Salesforce, ServiceNow, Workday, etc., to be more like that, because that would be certainly more flexible in terms of responding to their customers' needs. So if it's a kind of a pay-as-you-go, not only per subscription, but also actually per utilization, maybe of the SaaS platform. So, is this customer who's, let's say, in Workday, using all the features and functions of Workday, or they're kind of just basic stuff, name, address, telephone number, national insurance number, something like that kind of usage, and holiday days, taken holiday days remaining, that kind of thing? Or actually, do they use, some of the other functions that Workday offers, whatever those happen to be? So maybe a kind of a tiered subscription as well. And if a customer, let's say, breaks through, either because they want to or inadvertently breaks through, let's say, the first tier, the subscription ought to just track that, and the customer pays for that as they go. So if they do kind of break into the second tier of those functions, they get charged for that because they're now using them, that's fine. But when they stop using them, it drops again. That kind of tracking subscription, sort of approach versus a flat subscription. You pay X amount of pounds per seat, as you said, whether you use it or not, or whether that person left the company and we forgot to close their record or not, you still get charged for that.
Yeah, I think that's right. It plays back into the cloud development piece, which says, are the applications that they're putting into SaaS modular enough to do that? And I get the suspicion that in the panic that there was pre-COVID, I mean, when the move to SaaS really started to take hold, that a lot of software companies were worried that they had to have a SaaS offering, and really just lifted and shifted. And actually, you've got fairly monolithic apps. It's quite difficult for them to do. I mean, the one who came out best out of this, I suppose, was Salesforce. Out of the conversations I was having, was that it was a highly parameterized piece of software, and that you could pick and choose the sort of parameters you wanted to do, which sort of sounded a bit better. I mean, I didn't get to really understand what that meant, but I got the sort of sense that it was easier to use, sections of it and only get charged for sections of it. But many of them were, and Microsoft Office is probably the worst example of where, you pay for everything or nothing, so it's, anyway, but that's my rant over.
Yeah, I mean, I think, for me, it's definitely cloud. It's not the cloud in terms of, the resources that are provided to us, and we can do whatever we like with those resources, use them the way that we want. However, the service that, sort of SaaS offers, as the name implies, because it's not something that we're managing and running, and that's, I think, the aspect of it that maybe people don't necessarily always sort of consider, is because we're not running it, because we're not maintaining it and versioning it, and to a degree securing it as well. Most SaaS solutions, you assume that your data is secured and encrypted, and if you want it to be sovereign, it can also be sovereign as well. Most of these SaaS providers do offer that. Because those aspects, the kind of the maintenance and management aspects, are not something that we're having to do anymore, versus HR systems, whatever they happen to be back in our data center. That aspect of it, kind of defines it for me as being cloud. It's not our usual cloud where we get a resource, a compute resource, and we can do whatever we like with that compute resource. However, it's still kind of, part of that realm of cloud. Is just a specific kind of aspect of cloud for me. And we have seen a lot of reliance on it as well. There's a lot of, as you said, kind of, when people kind of migrated into cloud, it was almost a given that your CRM, sales, HR is going to end up in like Salesforce or, Workday or something like that, because it just made sense. And those were, platforms that were kind of backbone of the business, but they were not kind of dynamic in the way, that maybe other systems are, and kind of more, customer facing or outside world facing platforms. But they needed that kind of reliance, and you just needed them to be ticking over as they were kind of in the data center. But because of this, we've now kind of decided to go to cloud. They were part of that sort of migration piece as well.
Yeah, no, I think you make a good point there, and I was probably being a little sort of naughty in terms of just driving at them, in that way. But it was, the sense of, concern, I think there was people. But the other one that's interesting, and I think it'll probably be for a future session, is if you look at things like SAP, the challenge SAP have got of getting customers on their existing on-premises SAP environments across, because they are so customized. Yes. And again, we had 3 or 4 customers who were SAP customers, talking about the customizations they've done and the challenge of getting to a SaaS environment in that case. SAP have had to say they're going to support the on-premises environment until 2040.
Wow.
Yeah,
good luck
shows you the scale of the problem. But anyway. So rant over.
And just final point for me is, I've actually seen a lot of proliferation recently of these sort of collaboration platforms as well. So the likes of Miro, whichever way you pronounce it, ClickUp, Notion, and so on. And also obviously the most recent batch with AI. So obviously likes of ChatGPT, but also things like Imagine, NVIDIA, Pika Labs, a whole bunch of others. These have all immediately gone to SaaS. They've not necessarily said, oh, it's an application you install and you run it and it connects back to, it's not a client server, traditional client server sort of approach. Or indeed it's the solution comes out first as a mobile app. Some of them have, but predominantly they've been SaaS solutions, and you just connect to them, you register with your personal account, and you connect with them through your browser and you start using them. So lots of these are that kind of consumer version of SaaS, if you like, which is a lot more maybe easier to push out as a solution for people to have a go at.
Yeah, interesting you talk about consumer, because obviously we've seen over the last decade and more, the consumerization of business IT.
Mm.
I think it's just another step on that, and I agree with you. Those new ones are developed for a genuine cloud environment and a genuine use this functionality when and as you need it. Much better than the older software vendors who've had to try and migrate their on-premises systems into a SaaS environment, and maybe that's where the challenge lies.
Indeed. Right, so let's move on to our second topic, which was the Intel and AMD duopoly being under threat from ARM. So it's not a statement, it's a question, but nevertheless, there seems to be a little bit of a perfect storm that I picked up on recently, and it's kind of been maybe coming for some time. We've seen certainly the x86 world kind of losing out on things like mobiles and and tablets and handheld devices. It's never really been a serious contender in that space, despite several attempts by Intel in the early days to compete with ARM-based processors. The most recent stuff is I picked up on a number of news items. They all come from the register, so maybe viewers can actually appreciate that. I do check the register quite often, but I think it does give a kind of a good source, and it does point to the original sources of the news items as well. So a number of items kind of came to my attention recently. One is kind of just slightly outside of these, although it has been mentioned a number of times, is obviously Apple moving away from Intel a few years ago, developing their own chip. As much as I'm not a fan of Apple and their ecosystem and all that, but they certainly ditched Intel a few years ago and started developing their own ARM processors, the M series, for their Macs and what have you. So that was certainly a big blow for Intel, because that was obviously a massive customer and kind of supply route for them as well. But the more recent ones have been I don't think it's confirmed, but it's kind of rumors that NVIDIA is developing a ARM-based CPU specifically for the PC market. And it's not due next year, it's potentially due in 2025. But this is a specific and deliberate, I think, development to try and kind of, offer something in that PC market space, which NVIDIA has not really kind of played in. They played in mobile, they played in GPU, they played in HPC kind of places, and even some of their stuff I think you can get in public cloud now for for AI-based sort of activity. But it was interesting, this October report that said that NVIDIA is actually developing a specific ARM-based CPU for the PC market as a PC device. And the interesting bit was not just that rumor for me. The interesting bit was how Intel stock seemed to be connected and linked to that announcement. Intel stock actually took a 3% hit when that announcement or that rumor came out. And for me, judging again from looking at the past and being a student of history, whenever somebody else's stock starts being affected by an announcement on the other side of the universe, so to speak, in this ecosystem, it's kind of it kind of starts. I start getting tingles around sort of that happening, and I'm now wondering whether this is kind of inextricably linked together. Anything that these kind of players in the ARM space make, Apple, Qualcomm, NVIDIA, and so on make, will start affecting that kind of those traditional players, the likes of Intel and AMD. What was your thought around that, Paul?
I was intrigued by. I mean, you sent me the various register, and I look at the register fairly regularly, but I hadn't picked up on these. The one for me, which was fascinating, was Pat Gelsinger's comment.
Yeah.
which was, I literally, quote unquote, was ARM and Windows client alternatives generally, they have been relegated to pretty insignificant roles in the PC business. And you think he's setting himself up for a sort of Ken Olsen, head of IBM, we only need 3 mainframes, distributed computing is never going to take off routine. And I think he's potentially going to go down in history as one of those, because I absolutely do believe that there's some significant changes coming. And there's a certain amount of hubris around sort of Intel at the moment. And they focused so much on the server market. They focused so much on standard, CPU type capabilities. And I've seen, just looking at the infrastructure practice, the way in which the whole of the sort of infrastructure layer is changing in terms of it's not standard anymore. I think this is one of the things we're going to see, is that you're not going to have a standard CPU. You're going to have very specific CPUs to do different tasks. I think the PC market in a few years will look very different, because you'll get horses for courses. We've all been used to general purpose PCs, and I don't think that's going to be the case. I mean, you could also make a case that, is the PC going to die in the next 10 years? Quite possibly, because the way in which we interact with machines is going to change. Browse and type is going to be replaced by sort of, almost interactive, visual and spoken interconnects with the device you're playing with, and very different form factors. And each of those will need different types of hardware configuration. So I think there's, some challenges in terms of, PCs became really very cheap, if you think about it, in terms of, I always used to laugh that, you every time you bought a new PC after about 2 or 3 years, going through the 90s and into the early 2000s, you were getting twice the power for half the cost. It was amazing. And I think maybe that environment's going to change, that we're going to have quite specific sets of machines, for tasks. And will consumers first and then businesses actually need PCs? Don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. To a degree, I agree with you in terms of the form factor. I think the device itself, the kind of the utilization or the need for that type of device will not go away. It might change form factor, and how we interact with it might change also. But I think a device that's kind of slightly bigger than your phone in terms of screen and and capability and so on will still be required. So the other thing I picked up on that, in that specific report, was that this was actually being done with Microsoft's blessing. Now I think Microsoft's big enough now to kind of throw money at certain things, even if they don't work out, and it just kind of keeps them in, keeps quiet about them if they don't work out. If they do work out, like ChatGPT, it's like, way, it puts it out. But it's interesting again that it was done with their blessing. And obviously, NVIDIA's playing in a lot of markets. So it's a really serious contender and has been for a number of years. It's done challenging designs to Intel and AMD with the Grasshopper CPUs. It's done chips for video game consoles, so the Nintendo Switch is ARM based and so on, and also did I dug up some more information that actually did the Tegra chip for Microsoft a few years ago for was it Windows RT, I think it was called, that ARM based version of Windows.
Yeah,
something like that. I think it was Windows RT or something like that. But yeah, I think the quote that they picked up on and I picked up on as well from Pat Gelsinger was it's an insignificant threat.
Yeah,
but it's still a threat. I think the operative word there is threat, and that's kind of the thing that they're not really weighing up properly. But the other, and then the other quote was, "History will be our guide." Now, again, I agreed with the register there, and they said, "I'm not sure what kind of history or what version of history Pat Gelsinger is looking at, but it's strange." But anyway,
that's why I mentioned Ken Olsen and the original.
Exactly. Yeah, and obviously this is coming from the the ex CEO of VMware.
Yeah.
So I was working for Heptio when VMware acquired Heptio, and 2 weeks later I was gone. I just didn't want to really work for VMware. So yeah,
I
I'm
mean,
not sure about that.
There's been a term in the marketing world for many, many years. It was coined back in the 1960s, which was marketing myopia.
Yeah.
Where the big players in any one market could become blind to what was going on around them. I mean, you've seen it over and over again, big players disappearing simply because they didn't see the changes going on around them or didn't believe they were important.
Yeah.
And I think there's a danger that Intel will be into that space. I mean, they are huge, and therefore, a bit like IBM, they don't disappear overnight. They'll still be around. They'll still be making money. They'll still have players, but if you like, the movers and shakers in the market will move to other companies like Nvidia. I mean, Qualcomm are sort of throwing their weight around as well out there too. So I think, yeah, it is a changing marketplace. I agree with you that there will always need to be some sort of device, but I'm sort of sitting here on a desktop computer that acts as my sort of multimedia server and communications and all those sort of things, and my laptops are getting used less and less because when I go, I do most of my work in this sort of format. And I think an awful lot of people are using, the Zoom generation, all those sort of things. The need for the road warriors with their laptops is whereas actually you go somewhere and your smaller form tablet or smartphone is probably enough for what you need to do when you're out on the road.
Yeah.
So I think there are challenges. Yeah, I absolutely. The question you posed at the beginning, is that duopoly going to be under threat? And I think the answer is yes.
Yeah, I do agree. And just a couple of other points on that I picked up on as well. Microsoft has started offering advice on how to code in ARM. So there's like an advisory service for developers, and that was another point that we picked up on. A piece of news under that from Counterpoint Research said that ARM-powered PCs will be 25% of the market by 2027, and that's not too far away. And that's an increase from 14% today, according to them.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. But ARM-based is definitely here, and it's definitely staying, and it's definitely growing. And then you mentioned also Qualcomm. So yeah, Snapdragon obviously being their mobile chip, that's been extremely successful, especially with the Chinese and sort of Far East manufacturers of mobile phones. And let's face it, they own the in terms of numbers and sales, they're much larger than anybody else. So at the Snapdragon Summit, which was in October this year, late October, they announced the X Elite PC components range, and this includes a ARM-based CPUs, which are system on a chip, and these again are aimed at the PC market. They're not aimed at mobile. They're system on a chip, and they're aimed at the PC market. And these apparently, according to Qualcomm, will go head to head with Apple and Intel chips as well in terms of performance. Cool. And they compared it, I think, with a particular model of the Core i7. I'll include the descriptions or the links of the of these news items in the description of the video. But that comparison with the Core i7 mobile chip was the Qualcomm processor was 60% higher in terms of its performance.
Yeah, I think from a pure performance and maybe even a sort of sustainability point of view, there will be pressures on Intel. But one of the big challenges, and I think Qualcomm had it more than Nvidia, was the ability for them to support all the different drivers and all the APIs that are required. They were not as up to date and part of the PC ecosystem. And therefore, that's been a bit more of a challenge. They need to address that before they become a really serious player. But nonetheless, I mean, the market is opening up. It was, you felt that the barriers to entry to anybody challenging Intel was huge. and then you've sort of had people creeping in around the edges. But I think it, with the changes in technology and the changes in the way we use compute means that Intel really need to watch what's going on.
Indeed. So so what do you think? Is it a gathering storm or is it a perfect storm?
It's a gathering storm. It's not a perfect storm for Intel yet. I mean, their market position, the amount of money they plow into that, they just need to be more agile in the way in which they're going to react to the market. I think they might need to look at the way in which they design, all the sort of, they need a root and branch, look at how they work and the market. It's not yet a perfect storm. I mean, I think we'll still have, we'll still be talking about Intel in 10 and 15 years time. But whether they have the dominant position in the market, I seriously doubt.
Yeah, and it'll be maybe reminiscing about Intel's dominance and not necessarily praising what they're doing in 10, 15 years time.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to the third topic, which was will developers accept platform engineering? So platform engineering seems to have come up recently in this kind of bizarre love triangle between development, SRE, and platform engineering. I saw a really nice diagram, which I will try and include in the link for that in the description of the video. But it seems to be kind of coming in to set best practices and standards for DevOps. So everything from kind of trying to achieve software maturity in terms of the tools, the software tools that are used, the tool sets that are used, to providing more platform stability, helping sort of developer onboarding, so kind of making the onboarding of a new developer easier into an organization, trying to deal with the resolution of incidents more easily, and also governance, adding in some kind of governance in that space as well. So it's not really a product as yet. I've not kind of seen somebody say, here's my open source or proprietary PE platform, and this hooks into your, whatever CI/CD sort of platform, the DevOps platform that you use, or your GitOps platform, or your SRE tools. Or I've not really seen, or observability for that matter. So I've not really seen it as a product, but it seems to be kind of best practices for standardizing sort of a DevOps approach. So like I said, it's kind of in that bizarre triangle. I still call it bizarre because I really don't see how, I'm still struggling to see how it's going to really fit in that space. Although, like I said, that diagram kind of gave you a Venn diagram of how all three, DevOps, platform engineering, and SRE, can fit together. But through this creation of the so-called internal developer platform, the IDP, which is what platform engineering aims to create, they're kind of trying to really standardize around those tools and kind of the DevOps sort of tool set and the approach, how you do that, and so on. Yeah, I saw a couple of quotes, but I just kind of want to maybe get your take on it first, and we'll come back to mine.
Yeah, I think we've seen over the course of, well, probably much longer, but certainly over the past few years, this challenge of how do I industrialize that process? If we're now talking about developing more apps, in a more agile fashion, faster, cheaper, how do I industrialize that? Because fundamentally, software development has not been an industrialized process for many, many years. Gartner, I think in the 1990s, called it a cottage industry. But what you've got is people trying to solve problems and getting very comfortable with the tools, and actually not wanting the change of, if it's just going to make me do something boring and or more, with tools I don't really believe in, all those sort of issues. There's some cultural issues, but I think it's this basic challenge of saying, how do I get an industrial process into something that has been seen as almost a creative industry. You know, developers are creative, you know, and you rely on that creativity. Are we going to, you know, drive them out of the industry in droves because it's getting too boring to be shoehorned into this sort of process? And, you know, and DevOps has always been sort of as much about culture as it is about the actual tool sets. And those that have done it well, you look at places, I mean, the Financial Times, I think, has been particularly good at moving its environment into a DevOps arena and bringing everybody on board and along with it, you know. So I think there are sort of cultural issues that have got to be addressed. So that's my take on it, because I agree with you. It's not, I mean, I've tried to get my head around, is it a product or is it, you know, a set of best practices? And I think it's certainly the latter at the moment.
Yeah, and I found a company called Port, P-O-R-T, which kind of seems to be really focused. I mean, we've had a lot of conversation, and I did both for kind of, you know, industry pundits and people are kind of, you know, in that sort of DevOps space have also jumped on the bandwagon. There's loads of that kind of postings that you get on LinkedIn and various other places, and, you know, likes of CodeFresh, Weaveworks have kind of been in that sort of GitOps, you know, DevOps space, and you know, presumably they're kind of, you know, all advocating that. But this company called Port, I think, had a couple of interesting things. So that one of the quotes that said, you know, platform engineering is responsible for reducing developers' cognitive load while interacting and delivering software. So yes, to a degree, and that's kind of maybe spinning it in a positive way. Like I said, my thing is, will developers actually like this? Because the next quote, will they like being dictated to in terms of the tools, platforms, development environments, APIs, and things like that, that they're, you know, that will be kind of, you know, pushed on them basically by platform engineering. So I can appreciate the governance, you know, there being a need to kind of standardize and having governance around this sort of thing. But at the same time, developers are, you know, kind of very sort of free and wild in terms of their approach. They do kind of radical, you know, development. They bring in radical ideas and things like that. So I'm just kind of a little bit concerned whether they will like this kind of dictation and this sort of standard being, you know, dropped on them from platform engineering, and B, whether that actually will generally stifle that kind of innovation and, you know, trying out new ideas, you know, picking up on a new open source project and, you know, integrating that into what they're doing and kind of, you know, utilizing that as part of their, you know, development and things like that. So that's a point to consider, but I'll take a point from you and then I'll come back to another quote from Paul.
So almost an opposing view to that if you look at potentially what AI is going to do to coding too, in terms of, you know, the Copilot type approach, you know, in terms of generating, you know, automating and really being in control of that sort of pipeline from that perspective. In theory, it ought to release the developers to be more intuitive, inventive and thinking outside the box, as it were, and leave AI, if you like, or leave the process or you know, platform engineering to industrialize the process, to take them out. Now that, you know, challenge will, you know, if we've got X 100,000 or million developers out there, will all those be able to move into this sort of more developmental, you know, thinking outside the box arena and not have to worry? Interesting about the cognitive load. I think potentially it could make life more interesting for developers, because at the moment there must be an awful lot of, you know, going back around the houses and fixing bugs and you know, being under pressure to deliver to the latest CI/CD, you know, pipelines that are going on, which must drive, you would have thought would have driven them nuts. It would certainly drive me nuts. But I think it ought to do that. But then the question is, will there be as many? So in my world, the infrastructure world, we've got exactly the same problem in terms of moving people off tool sets that they know and love into something slightly more standardized in the observability space. You know, every operations IT operations team has its own favorite tools, and by and large, management have refused the challenge or run up against the challenge of saying to those teams, you will drop this ABC tool and use this platform, and literally you go round and round, and you're struggling to get companies to reduce from 20 different tools to 5, never mind going to one platform. So I think I agree with you. I think it will be a challenge, and it's a cultural thing, but we're not sort of getting to the point of saying, how are we going to use people's skills in an AI world in a very, very different way? So I think that's a big challenge.
Yes, I mean, yeah, I think the keynotes I did recently, I talked about that kind of, the AI aspect of kind of how's that, impacting sort of development. And I think platform engineering, I'm just not sure it's coming in at the right time. I just wish it had kind of come in after developers figured out how they're going to use AI, and then it would kind of come and say, okay, now we're going to set some standards and governance around this and around the whole thing. How you've been doing sort of DevOps and CI/CD, how you're using AI in that space and so on. It just almost seems to be kind of, stacking a lot of stuff on top of developers. And like I said, they love their freedom. They love their tools. They love their IDEs. They love kind of, which sources they go to kind of get their code, or, who they talk to, and, and where do they get inspired from. And, and that kind of, I'm just a bit worried about that kind of innovation being stifled somewhat, in that sort of developer space. But the other quote I want to say was, so this was kind of, I think, Port trying to maybe kind of put an explanation around sort of platform engineering. So it said, and I quote, when a developer needs to implement a new feature, they need to know a few things beforehand. Which microservice APIs do they need to interact with? Who owns those microservices? How can they add a new cloud resource with Terraform or Pulumi? How would they roll out a new version? And what environments are involved in the process? Close quotes. So that's that was their introduction to, explaining platform engineering, and the platform engineering presumably will help in those areas. But I think for me, the point, as soon as I read that paragraph, the point for me was, but developers like doing those things themselves. They like to figure out, and then if somebody said, oh, we don't have an API for that, and they say, well, I'll write an API for that. And that's the kind of the freedom that they have. But the likes of Port and this kind of whole platform engineering movement seems to be saying, no, we'll dictate to you what you can use and what you can't use. And if there's a tool, if you're a new developer to this company and you come in with a whole bunch of ideas and tools, well, forget those, because we do it this other way at this company.
It's interesting listening to you, and you're passionate about these topics, which is fascinating. But I'm sort of putting myself now in the business leader's shoes. And if he was
playing devil's advocate, as always,
he was a fly on the wall listening to this conversation, he would be horrified. Or she, sorry, in this day and age, it might be a she. It ought to be. And you get to the point of saying, the danger is you're becoming too enamored of what you do, not what outcomes you're looking to try and achieve. And yeah, I know they're developers, they're artists. I mean, they see themselves as artists.
Yeah, absolutely.
Don't want to stifle that, but on the other hand, how much real value are you delivering? We talk about value engineering, value-based engineering. Yeah. So maybe that's another topic for us to discuss in the future, where that one's going, because we're losing sight of that debate or the discussion that says, actually, what are we trying to achieve here in terms of the business? Or whether it's us as consumers, what are we getting from the companies that we deal with? It's the business leaders going, God, how am I actually going to ensure that we can deliver what the customer wants at a price he's prepared to pay? If we've got everybody doing these things that are fundamentally not very efficient, they might be very they're engaging for the people doing it, but are they adding value? So I'm just playing devil's advocate. I absolutely understand what you're saying. I'm seeing it over and over again. But maybe we just need to raise that level of debate up to the next layer, and to shine a light that says, guys, if you want to be in a job in 20, 30 years time, you need to understand that.
Yeah, and I do appreciate that. Like I said, for me, sort of the governance sort of comes in, and there's different ways of playing that. We can still, I think, achieve the governance that we need, but maybe we don't need it to be at that sort of DevOps level. Maybe we introduce it at a higher level where it can be kind of part of our, let's say, policy as code. So whatever the developer produces, it maybe doesn't pass everything. It fails at some point in that chain before that code goes into production, because since we were tracing how that piece of code was developed, it didn't meet all of our criteria. So what you're saying to the developer there is, you need to think about a different way of doing this that will meet our policies, but not dictating to them what tools and platforms and whatever to necessarily use. So the developer will have to go back and find a different way that will get their code to pass through everything and will end up in production. So you're kind of retro, sort of retro way of kind of getting them to think about how they can change the way they do development and what tools they use and things like that to make their code pass the kind of the governance standard, if you like, versus saying to them, no, you will use this IDE, not that IDE. You will use this API, not that API, and so on. So that's a kind of maybe a different approach that will bring in that governance, but it's not a dictation, so to speak. I just think, and I'm not a developer, so I'll certainly be kind of interested in learning more. I mean, I've kind of hung up my development shoes decades ago, but I'd just certainly be interested in hearing from developers on this point. And do they feel that platform engineering? Are they aware that platform engineering is coming down the line? And B, how do they feel about kind of maybe these things kind of being slightly dictated to them?
Yeah, I mean, clearly I'm not a developer either, so maybe you'll have to, one of your other shows will have to look at that in more detail, because I think it's an interesting challenge that's coming up. But I keep sort of thinking, well, because when we pinged each other and about today's topics, and I said, well, it doesn't have to be this tool or that tool. If the sort of framework and the processes are right, you can use a variety of different. So if it's just about the tools they want to use, but there are some sort of gating standards, process flows, whatever, that need to be adhered to. But if you want to use a different tool to achieve the same thing, fine, you go ahead and do that.
I agree, and I think what I'm seeing is that some people are talking about it as a framework, but others are saying, we're going to encapsulate here these kinds of tools, and then we're going to encapsulate here these kinds of tools, and then when the developer comes in, depending on what they're doing, they're going to choose one of those two.
Right.
Yeah.
I think this is a perennial issue of that you're seeing in the industry, that it sort of breaks up into lots of different parts with lots of different tools, efforts then to optimize what's going on until a new set of technologies comes along that sort of throws it up in the air again. So I think it's part of that ongoing process, but there ought to be and there should be a way of ensuring that you don't lose developers' innovation and inventiveness, but we're at the same time delivering quickly, effective, resilient, reliable code. I don't know. And I'm not, I'm not an IT operations person either. So it's a challenge. It has been, but there must be a way of ensuring that, it feels like a framework, not a specific product. It really does feel like a framework, not a product.
Yeah, and I am in favor of maybe, again, I've not seen any statistics about developers complaining about cognitive, load and things like that. And although that may well be true, My question, kind of bottom line for me is, will developers actually like this? Will they find it, helpful or detrimental to them? And how much is it going to impact their freedom, so to speak?
Better ask them, I think.
I think that's a good idea. I think that might be an up and coming talk that I'll do on the channel. Excellent. Okay, well, we've come to the end of this edition. Thank you, Paul, again, as always. Really appreciate your insights. I think every time I speak to you, kind of learn something new, and you get me thinking in a different direction. So your input's always appreciated.
And it is a great process, because you get me thinking about different things too.
Well, there you go.
So my own great
complementary in that way. Yeah, fantastic.
Challenge.
All the links for the topics that Paul and I have discussed today, the news stories, news items that we picked up on and we've mentioned, will be in the description of the video. That's it for this month, and we'll see you soon. Thank you for watching this talk. If you enjoyed the content, please comment, share, like, and subscribe to support the channel. You may also want to check out some of the other videos on this channel. See you next time.